On the 7th of April, as some of you might remember, Donald Trump launched 59 Tomahawk missiles from US warships onto an airbase in Syria. And this marked quite a dramatic shift in policy. Throughout his campaign, Trump had argued that he wouldn't be escalating conflict in Syria. And he explained his reversal, his decision to change his policy, in two ways. First, he said this was a rational decision. He'd conducted an analysis of American foreign policy and decided it was in a national interest to declare this strike. And secondly, he argued this was an emotional decision, that he had been moved by scenes of a chemical weapons attack in Syria, and this had motivated him to launch a strike. Now, this obviously captured my attention as a historian of war and emotion, because it kind of exemplified what I research on, the idea that war and emotion are related, that emotion impacts upon declarations of war or decisions to make peace. So, really, I suppose, what this moved me towards was thinking about how our emotions are affected by war. Donald Trump himself was affected by these images of a Syrian weapons attack, and his decision to make war was also affected by his decision to make war was affected by his emotion. His war is affected by this emotion, and vice versa. So his emotion was affected. I'm really struggling now. We'll give you a minute. All right. So Trump himself was heavily criticized for this decision. He was very heavily criticized for using emotional reasoning rather than rational reasoning. And this is mainly because emotion and rationality, emotion and reason, are seen as things which are contrary. They're seen as unrelated, especially in the field of war and diplomacy and global politics. Emotion is seen as something which should be subdued, seen as something that should be overcome. It's seen as a weakness. We expect our politicians and statesmen to think along the lines of using logic and reason to make their decisions. And Trump was heavily criticized in the media, and he was also statesmen and politicians across the aisle started thinking maybe we're reaching a brave new world of emotional reasoning. Maybe the time has come for us to think that our politicians are only going to be motivated by their feelings rather than by rationality. But I think that might be going too far. That might be simplifying things a little too much. Because a lot of these key aspects of foreign policy are actually things which are incredibly emotional. If you think about national security, if you think about deterrence, if you think about cooperation, these are concepts of national security and foreign policy which are actually incredibly emotional. You cannot think about national security without thinking about emotions and feelings like anxiety, like fear, like apprehension. You have to think about these emotions in order to understand why statesmen and states actors take the decisions they do and in what way they do so. But before I go any further, I thought it'd be worth thinking about what actually emotions are. That might seem like quite a simple point. We all understand the concept of positive emotion. We all know what it means to be happy, to have hope or love. And we all understand the concept of negative emotions, fear, hatred, anger, jealousy. But actually, there's no agreed upon definition of what an emotion is. The Oxford English Dictionary describes emotion as an agitated state of mind or an excited mental state, and uses examples like fear and hope and love and anger to illustrate that. And this draws upon a whole ream of research into so-called basic emotions, which argues that there's 5, 6, 7 sometimes basic primary human emotions that we all have and we all share, and then a category of secondary emotions as well. I have kind of 3 problems with this idea. Firstly, it doesn't really take into account what we call effective reactions, which is how we respond emotionally to external stimuli or scenarios. It confuses emotion and mood. It doesn't really distinguish between emotion and mood. And this means that things like optimism, pessimism, apathy, boredom, enthusiasm, excitement, defeatism, melancholy, don't really fit into this kind of definition of emotion. So we don't really know what to do with them. And it doesn't really take into account the relationship between sort of feelings and physical reactions. So if I was to ask if anyone in the room is feeling happy. Is anyone a happy person? Hands up if anyone thinks of themselves as a happy person. Few people. So you might think of yourselves as being happy people, but you're probably not feeling physically happy right now. You're not experiencing this kind of characterization, this dopamine rush, which we think of as happiness. Another one. Anyone feeling angry about global poverty, about the inequalities in a society? Anyone feeling angry about that? More people, I hope, are feeling angry about global poverty. But you're not experiencing the physical sensations of anger. You're not experiencing the adrenaline or the blood pressure of anger. So I think the idea that emotion equates to feeling doesn't necessarily work. Scholars like myself are more think of emotions as cultural constructs. So I'm less interested in what emotions are, but in what they do. And cultural constructs, emotions as cultural constructs, that means that emotions shape the surfaces of individuals and they shape our collective identities. And I suppose an example to illustrate that would be fear. If you think about your fear of an object or a person, say a spider, that's not shaped by any existential danger posed by that spider. It's shaped by your cultural memories and our shared social norms that we've kind of learned to associate that spider as a threat, as a danger to us. Or in the same way, you could think about hatred. Hatred we may have for a particular group of people doesn't come from any innate inner dislike we have, but it comes from our past experiences and our cultural memories that have meant that we associate that person with a threat to our way of life or a fear to our own identities. So I guess what I mean by this is that emotions are not passive. They work to reaffirm the boundaries between us. They work to reaffirm our identities. So emotions sustain identities and they sustain norms. So if we think about this in the international arena, what that means is that emotions can help us understand why states behave the way they do. They can help us understand why states might violate some norms and why they might uphold and conform to others. Because we can think, we should theorize states as groups, which is theorize states as groups. States are, they have interests and they have identities and they can be influenced by emotions. So for example, apathy, a perception that states are kind of empathy, and a perception that states are empathetic, can encourage them to cooperate and pursue cooperative policies rather than antagonistic policies. The idea of popular enthusiasm, which is somewhere I research on, the idea that a population can be enthusiastic for war, can encourage a state to violence just as readily as any kind of rational analysis of interests. Historians of World War I have started to uncover how, in the period before kind of the July crisis, states were motivated by a widespread perception, not so much the truth, but a perception that their populations were motivated and excited for war. And this kind of incited violence far more than any kind of rational analysis of which states were interested in what. We can also think about, another example could be the counterterrorism methods employed by the US government in the aftermath of 9/11. These kind of counterterrorism methods can only be really understood if we think about feelings of humiliation and fear. The humiliation of the US being attacked and the desire to humiliate others in return. The fear of terrorist attacks, which kind of justified security measures against future threats. And these kind of the US state government's reaction to 9/11 really encapsulated, really tapped into the general emotional mood of the public at that time. Emotions can also help us understand how states try and control and manipulate morale during war. The idea of trying to prevent defeatism among their own populace and try and encourage defeatism amongst the enemy. And a good example of this would be think about aerial bombing campaigns from World War II through to kind of Syria today. The idea that these campaigns, aerial bombing campaigns, aren't just about damage and military power, but they're about demonstrating the viability and the impotence of the enemy. Or another example could be counterinsurgency tactics, which we see again very prominently today. The idea of counterinsurgency, which are often population-centric, local strategic operations. And the emotional dimension behind this is the aim is to win hearts and minds. And the approach they take to these kind of operations, the emotional dimension, often involves rebuilding schools and amenities and hospitals and trying to create an atmosphere of trust, respect, hope. Whether or not any of these strategies actually work is another matter, which I'm not going to go into. But these are kind of like the emotional dimensions behind global politics and war. So to get back to where I started, are we entering a brave new world of emotional reasoning in politics? I would say no, because emotions have dictated state actions for a very long time. But where we are entering into a brave new world is perhaps our awareness of this, our awareness of the role that emotions actually play at a global political level, which is something which we haven't necessarily appreciated up to this point. And it's something that historians like myself and people who work in kind of the contemporary political sphere are starting to become aware of and starting to comment on and starting to react to. I think by taking account of emotions in this context, we can start to really understand why things happen in the world. From mundane decisions we take every day, through to the kind of big acts of war, acts of terrorism, acts of genocide. I think without thinking about these from an emotional standpoint, they're just incomprehensible. But if we start thinking about them from this background of emotion, we can start making them intelligible. Thank you very much.